August 2021 was a deeply strange month in the media, and you probably didn't notice. You may have noticed that during August, Americans began complaining constantly about Australia's coronavirus response. So, where did this transatlantic interest come from? It's a story of misinformation, bad marketing strategies succeeding wildly, and the journey of one lie around the world. It's the story of why every corner of social media and the US press now contains people who truly believe that Australia has become a communist dictatorship. It begins with Australia's biggest YouTube channel being banned for a week. Sky News Australia is owned by the Aussie branch of Rupert Murdoch's News Corp and is rumoured to change its name to Fox News Australia in the next 2 years. While Head of Operations Lachlan Murdoch, that's Rupert's son, has denied this, Sky says it's uncomfortable having its name associated with Sky News Australia's content. Namely, the COVID-19 misinformation that got Sky Australia's YouTube channel banned. What was the exact video? There doesn't seem to be a clear answer, but people point to several clips. One was called "Australians Must Know the Truth, that this virus is not a pandemic," end quote. Another has high-paid columnist Alan Jones expressing that masks and vaccines don't work. Sky editor Jack Houghton responded by comparing their ban to Maoist dictatorship and the Holocaust. Keep that in mind, it will come up again, unfortunately. One day later, on August the 3rd, the lie at the centre of this story showed up on the world's biggest podcast. American socialite Joe Rogan has near-daily guests on his show The Joe Rogan Experience for candid marathon interviews that last hours. He asked his guest, "Have you seen what's going on in Australia?" Then he said it. The whole continent is in lockdown because one old man died of coronavirus. He said that Australians were confined in their homes with an hour of exercise. Only true in places with hard lockdowns. That helicopters were ordering people inside with megaphones. False. And that they were experiencing dictatorship. His guest was a North Korean refugee. To prove this, Rogan asked his assistant Jamie to find a graph of Australian deaths, and found a recent one-death day, then decided that was enough research. Importantly, Rogan went on to tell the refugee that this was a slippery slope that began with gun control. Australia prevented its residents from owning automatic and semi-automatic rifles after a 1996 mass shooting, and has not had a serious mass shooting since. Other rifles and firearms are still common. So there was a soft lockdown in certain parts of Sydney, and there was a day one man died. Where's the lie? This can be called a lie by omission, but there's more happening. Australia and New Zealand's health experts lock down regions based on how far a cluster has gotten. Lockdown isn't a reaction to deaths, it's designed to prevent death by suffocating the spread of coronavirus. In short, Australia wasn't locked down. The city of Sydney wasn't locked down, but certain parts of Sydney were. There wasn't a lockdown because one man died. Only one man died that day because there was a lockdown. This is one lockdown strategy among many, and so far has been the most successful. To present, Australia's biggest day of coronavirus cases has been around 1,500 to a couple thousand. That number is closer to the average daily coronavirus deaths in the US. The key to this lie is in embellishing the truth. So you give one or two facts that actually are real, that are objectively true, and then you begin editorializing. You add one or two opinions that lead the facts to your worldview. This is when the audience begin filling in the facts that you didn't give them. They begin making assumptions that agree with your version of events. In this way, the facts begin working for you. They even begin working against the reality of things. It's really clever. But Joe Rogan makes the same mistake that a lot of people make in this situation, which is that he says too much. When he says that Australia shut down for one case, this goes from misleading to being an outright lie. And people pick up on that stuff. People notice when you're not telling them the truth. even when you're being a bit misleading, which is why the trick is to say as little as possible. Just after the Sky ban ended, on August 12, fringe Australian politician George Christensen appeared on the American Fox News to complain about his country's COVID response. He told anchor Laura Ingraham that Australia was suffering from, quote, pandemic policy insanity. Then, the lie had reached George Christensen on literally the other end of the world and bounced back to Laura Ingraham. Christensen gave his Fox News spiel to the Australian Parliament just before his appearance, which fact-checkers immediately tore apart. The public ridiculed him for a minute, and Australia heard no more about it. For now. This is when things got juicy. American conservative media constantly repeated these 2 points. 1. Australia locked down because one old man died, and 2. This happened because they gave up their guns. This message echoed down comment sections and through lobbying groups everywhere. The American jargon continued with the United Australia Party, a libertarian party designed to enrich its founder, mining billionaire Clive Palmer, and not necessarily do much else. They began a massive ad campaign centered around freedom of speech and encouraging vaccine misinformation, using politician Craig Kelly to get around spam laws which don't include political ads. In fact, it's illegal to hamper political ads. The UAP sent anti-vax and anti-lockdown SMSs to most Australian phone numbers. Currently, they're under investigation for misrepresenting government information in one of those messages. The UAP increasingly created ads and media appearances with American talking points. Kelly's social media posts began spreading the lie. Meanwhile, online, the pro-gun, anti-Australia messages came overwhelmingly from people who were anti-lockdown and anti-vax. Meanwhile, news headlines took on a Borg-like similarity. Australia's capital city to enforce snap lockdown after one COVID-19 case. New Zealand in lockdown after single Auckland case. Queensland's chief health officer warns of lockdown risk after one new COVID-19 case. Then something fascinating and rare happened. The rest of the media picked up this message. Even channels considered to lean left. This flew in the face of media fragmentation. Media fragmentation is a phenomenon where the average person will only receive media that agrees with them. In many ways, we do this to ourselves. For example, we tend to only read news sources that agree with us. And this is human nature. Although unbiased news regularly changes our view on things, we tend to trust sources that agree with our worldview, that align with things we've noticed in our environment, that align with things we know. The social media algorithm does this to us by having us spend the most time possible on their sites, and this causes us to make the most money for their advertisers. And they do this by only promoting things to us that we're going to agree with, because we spend the most time around people we trust, around friends, people who welcome us. Soon after, America's most watched and most corrected news entertainer, Tucker Carlson, called Australia a prison island of peasants during his Fox News program. During this time, Fox News gave Australia no right of reply. Even as it emerged, 93% of Aussies do not approve of anti-lockdown protesting. But we have to remember, Fox doesn't have the news ethical obligation to get both sides of the story, because legally they don't make news. Rather, they're entertainers. Carlson also incorrectly claimed Australians had to drink alcohol through their face masks. At this point, an opinion article in The Atlantic claimed that Australia had given up its rights and become unrecognisable. The Australian editor of the New York Times, American man Damien Cave, wrote something similar as Australia began building quarantine facilities to hygienically hold people arriving from overseas. He was one of many people saying that Aussie quarantine was a camp, where arrivals had to stay for 2 weeks, which made it a prison camp. Cave compared it to Australia's UN-defying, years-long detention of war refugees, while political groups pointed to the Holocaust. And now we've arrived at the propaganda point of no return. This was the beginning of a full onslaught. Lobby groups, internet users and bots pretending to be internet users and influencers would not stop talking about Australia. On Reddit, meme posts appeared on forums dedicated to neutral politics, calling Australia a prison island, while thousands of users posted a Daily Caller article and the Atlantic opinion piece, telling each other it was fact. Lobby group Texas Freedom Coalition posted a map of Australia calling it, quote, the world's biggest prison from space. The group later posted a series of sources, including the Atlantic piece and some of the misleading sources in this piece. Each group repeated that this would not happen if Australia didn't give up their guns. Many of these groups were initially deluged with Australians, telling them that they got their facts wrong, before these comments were deleted and the Aussies banned. Some banned every internet connection from the Australia region. The Texas Freedom Coalition banned an entire continent over the lie at the center of this story. So, you could say things got pretty serious. Now, astroturfing, if you don't know, is when a movement pretends to be by the people and for the people, but actually it's a little more central than that. There's an organisation pulling the strings and actually spending a lot of money to make you think a certain way, and to make it look like you're one of the majority. This was when media fragmentation, our tendency to only hear one side of the story, returned. In one corner, Americans told each other Australia was under a dictatorship. In the other, Australians in cities like Perth and Hobart shared pictures of themselves moving freely in public, making jokes while they did things that were supposedly impossible. Due to the social media algorithms favouring content where each person is likely to spend the most time, the people disagreeing with them did not see these posts. But did the media and politicians really start this? Didn't Joe Rogan independently bring this story to America? Not necessarily. That North Korean defector Rogan told about the Australian lockdown, Yeonmi Park, is a regular guest on Fox News, the most regular guest mentioned in this article. Almost all her claims to Fox, and now Rogan, about North Korea have been contradicted by childhood peers, people who are there, and herself, in South Korea, where she was a reality TV star. When Park listened to Joe Rogan accuse Australia of being a prison island, she answered in News Corp talking points. This is the real dictatorship. These people do not know they are prisoners. Park seemed to imply that Australia was worse than North Korea. So what really caused this? Election season could start at any moment in Australia, and Rupert Murdoch has been losing power. In elections past, people assumed that whoever Murdoch backed would win, which happened throughout the 2010s as the front pages of his biggest newspapers prominently endorsed conservative pro-business candidates. In Australia's state elections, News Corp has endorsed conservative candidates with glowing puff pieces and savage attacks on their opponents. And Murdoch's candidates have lost horribly. Most recently, in West Australia, Murdoch's pick was so badly beaten that News Corp began calling WA a one-party state, and the rest of the media agreed. News Corp's Australian branch has taken some softer stances, as people have become more progressive and community-minded, but it hasn't caught up to public opinion yet. While they have promised to stop denying climate change, they still Photoshop pro-lockdown politicians into Asian communist uniforms. In fact, this movement away from the right on social issues has clashed with the opinions of Lachlan Murdoch. So there is great incentive for hard-right Christians like Christensen to go to Murdoch's American news networks and preach what they want Australians to believe. And they have a lot of preaching to do. Remember, only 7% of Aussies approved of anti-lockdown protests as August began, according to Sydney-based pollsters Utting Research. Other polls showed that a large majority of people believed the expert health advice was the right solution. However, the Murdoch press and the Australian federal government are harshly against any health advice that slows business. Both are heavily lobbied by business interests, and that other powerful anti-science entity, Christian political groups. The government's Christian faction appears to be banking on the American resistance to hit Australia and swing voters with a louder message than the Aussie media could make. As for whether that great storm of trolls were genuine people who felt that way, conventional wisdom says that the simplest explanation is the most likely, and to not blame malice when you can blame stupidity. In the philosophy of logic, these are respectively called Occam's razor and Hanlon's razor. But in trolling, those rules don't apply. This is partly because troll farms don't just aim to change your opinion, they aim for communication breakdown. Institutional troll farms such as the Russian IRA, Chinese Wumao, and the publics of trolling companies such as Topham Guerin share the one tactic: just disagree. You don't have to be convincing. If you dissent against a message, people doubt it. It's dirt cheap, and it provides excellent flack. If you're losing a debate, it's an effective parachute. The cost to reward of just saying something ridiculous is astronomical. In this fog of war, this has made it equally likely that you are dealing with a deep-end conspiracy theorist or an army of robots online, because both have a lot of incentive to exist. In big, statistically significant issues like this, we can safely assume it's both. During the 2020 lockdown in Melbourne, Australia's biggest city after Sydney, almost all anti-lockdown tweets were sent by 3 people. The federal government also has a history of hiring troll farms. There's one major sign that this was a coordinated attack, and it's the most sure sign of astroturfing, an uncannily consistent message. That message was, Australians lost their freedom because they gave up their guns. Australians have no idea what guns have to do with the virus, but Americans have their Second Amendment rights. That is, the federal government can't make a law banning the right to own firearms, tied close to their personal freedoms. There's a powerful myth, Arthurian in its symbolism, that arming some citizens with a rifle prevents the government from making unnecessary demands. So if a country has some kind of gun control and is in a lockdown, it's a propaganda sweet spot for conservative channels, and their audience will attach the two ideas. Outside the US, we know this as a false cause fallacy, 2 events being incorrectly linked. But in the American mind, the ideas of firearms and freedom are linked from childhood. It's a neural wiring that you can manipulate at any time. And if you can convince a fringe of Australians that it works this way, they will come to trust wider, American-focused messages. Will the misinformation campaign work as intended? In my opinion, no. All this attention will not necessarily equal political action. Tucker Carlson, Craig Kelly, and Sky News Australia have one thing in common. Media experts regularly cite them as the most influential voices in their respective countries. While Carlson and Sky have the most views, and Kelly has the most social media engagement of any Australian politician, they also suffer from the same problem of viral advertising. Their viewers are casual, and not necessarily buying what they're selling. A slim minority of Australians believe the broader Sky message. For example, 8% and falling are climate change deniers. Kelly is an unpopular politician, set to badly lose his next election. Tucker Carlson is riding the Fox effect, which is a communication science term for the channel's ability to change voting habits. But they no longer have a decisive hold. Murdoch and his allies have record-breaking audiences. But those audiences don't seem to believe the message anymore. There's also one more issue. The entire mainstream media has been sharing this misleading angle since the start of 2021. If it bleeds, it leads. The dishonesty is difficult to spot because it relies on one little word, for. These cities locked down for one cluster, and with one case. The with tells you nothing about what causes a city to lock down. Interestingly, most of these articles gave a positive angle to the lockdowns, saying that they quashed cases and returned Australia to normal life. They were comparing the policy to the many American stances of letting people keep all their personal freedoms and living with any consequences. We could say everyone here is a victim of spectacle. All this trouble came from gawking. The media gawking at Australia's powerful response. The conservative Australian media gawking at itself, which influences and news channels amplified for profit and power, which the masses took on like a mimetic virus in a dense neighbourhood. And when an idea catches on among the people, it gets away fast.
Anyway, I really appreciate you watching, so take care of yourselves, be good to yourself, and be good to the truth.